There's a quiet question that sits behind a lot of modern financial stress, but almost nobody says it out loud because it feels uncomfortable, almost rude. And that question is this: if doing everything right leads to constant money anxiety, then what exactly are we working toward? In the United States and much of Europe, being financially average is not seen as a failure. It's often seen as success. You get educated, you get a job, you earn a respectable income, you pay your bills on time, and from the outside, your life looks stable. But stability today has a cost that rarely shows up on paper. The cost isn't just financial, it's psychological, it's time-based, and it compounds quietly over decades. Most people don't feel broke because they can't pay their bills. They feel broke because their money never seems to move them forward, it just circulates. Incomes rise, lifestyles adjust, obligations multiply, and somehow the finish line keeps moving further away. This isn't because people are careless or irresponsible. It's because the definition of average has changed, while the financial system around it has become far more expensive, more debt-driven, and more emotionally persuasive. Imagine a fairly typical scenario. Nothing extreme, no luxury lifestyle, no reckless spending. Just a normal working professional in their late 20s or early 30s living in a mid-sized American city or a European capital's outer zone. They earn what would be considered a good salary by most standards. Let's say around $70,000 a year in the US or the European equivalent after conversion. On paper, that sounds solid. It's above the national median. Friends and family would say they're doing well. But once taxes are taken out, that number changes quickly. Federal tax, state tax if applicable, Social Security, healthcare contributions. Suddenly that $70,000 becomes closer to $50,000 in actual take-home pay. Roughly $4,100 a month. Again, nothing unusual. This is where average really begins. From there, rent or a mortgage takes the first big bite. A modest one-bedroom apartment or starter home payment might cost $1,500 to $2,000 a month. Not luxury, not downtown penthouse living, just a clean, safe place in a decent area. Now the monthly income is already down to about $2,100. Then comes transportation, maybe a car payment of $400 plus insurance, fuel, maintenance. Another $600 gone. Student loan payments, even modest ones, might take $300. Credit card balances from earlier years don't disappear just because income improved. Another $200 minimum payment. Utilities, phone, internet subscriptions, groceries. Slowly, predictably, the remaining money evaporates. What's left is not zero, but it's fragile. A few $100s that feels like it should be savings, but somehow ends up being absorbed by birthdays, weddings, travel expectations, clothes for work, small lifestyle upgrades that feel justified because I earn a good salary now. This is where the real cost of being average starts to reveal itself. Not in dramatic financial collapse, but in stagnation. Every month looks responsible. Every expense feels reasonable in isolation. But together they create a life where money has no margin. There's no room for mistakes, no flexibility for risk, no space for patience. And the system quietly encourages this arrangement. Credit is easy. Monthly payments are framed as affordability. Social comparison reinforces spending that matches income rather than goals. The pressure isn't explicit. Nobody says you must spend this much. Instead, the message is subtle. This is what someone at your level does: a decent car, a decent apartment, occasional travel, eating out because time is limited. None of this is excessive. That's the problem. It's all normal, and normal is expensive now. Normal requires consistent income, constant participation, and long-term commitment to expenses that don't scale down easily when life changes. What makes this particularly difficult is that the financial stress doesn't come from deprivation. It comes from contradiction. People in this position aren't struggling to survive, but they're also not building anything meaningful. Their net worth grows slowly, if at all. Savings accounts feel symbolic rather than transformative. Retirement feels abstract and distant. And because everything looks fine on the surface, there's no clear moment where alarm bells ring. There's no obvious mistake to point to. That's why the discomfort lingers. It's the sense of running on a treadmill that's always set just a little too fast. You're keeping up, but you're tired. And deep down, there's a quiet awareness that if nothing changes, the next 20 or 30 years will look very similar to the last 5. Slightly higher income, slightly higher expenses, slightly higher stress. This isn't failure. It's what the modern financial system produces by default. And understanding that is the first step, not toward radical change or dramatic action, but toward clarity. What's important to understand is that nothing in that scenario looks like a mistake when you're inside it. In fact, from the inside, it feels responsible. You're not overspending recklessly. You're not gambling or chasing unrealistic dreams. You're simply responding to the costs placed in front of you. This is why the system works so well. It doesn't require people to be bad with money. It only requires them to accept the default path. And the default path is designed around cash flow, not net worth. Monthly affordability becomes the central decision-making tool. Can you afford the payment? Can your salary handle the EMI? Does it fit within your budget this month? These questions sound logical, but they quietly hide the long-term cost. When people say, I can afford it, what they usually mean is, I can make the payment without immediate pain. They're not thinking about opportunity cost or time or compounding. They're thinking about whether today's lifestyle feels stable and socially acceptable. That's a very human instinct, and it's exactly why being average has become so expensive. Let's slow the math down because this is where the reality becomes clearer. Take that $4,100 monthly take-home pay. After housing, transportation, debt payments, and basic living costs, maybe $400 to $600 remains. On paper, that sounds like savings potential, but in real life, it rarely becomes consistent investing. It becomes buffer money. It absorbs irregular expenses. It disappears during holidays, emergencies, or moments of emotional spending. And even when some of it does get saved, it often goes into low-yield accounts because liquidity feels safer than long-term commitment. Now compare this to the obligations. A car payment doesn't care if you had a bad month. Rent doesn't adjust based on your stress level. Student loans don't pause because inflation rose. These fixed costs lock your future income into past decisions. That's the hidden cost most people don't calculate. Average living today isn't paid for just with current income. It's paid for with future flexibility. Every fixed expense reduces your ability to respond to change, to invest aggressively when opportunities arise, or to step away from income temporarily without panic. This is where the system flaw becomes visible. The modern economy encourages people to front-load consumption and backload security. You enjoy the lifestyle now and promise yourself you'll get serious later. Later might mean saving more when you earn more, investing when life settles down, or paying off debt once things feel stable. The problem is that life rarely becomes cheaper or simpler. Income increases often come paired with new expectations: a nicer place, a better car, more social obligations, higher standards of comfort. None of this is irrational, it's social adaptation. Humans anchor their identity to their peer group. When your peers upgrade their lives, staying still feels like falling behind. So the average rises collectively, and the cost of staying average rises with it. What used to be considered luxury slowly becomes baseline. Air conditioning, smartphones, multiple subscriptions, regular dining out, frequent travel. Individually, these costs feel small. Collectively, they reshape the financial baseline of an entire generation. Psychologically, this creates a powerful loop. People measure success relative to effort, not outcome. If you're working hard, educated, employed, and responsible, it feels unfair to struggle financially. That feeling leads to rationalizing small comforts. You deserve them, you've earned them, and often that's true. The issue isn't enjoyment, it's timing. The system teaches people to reward effort immediately rather than delay gratification for structural stability. This isn't a moral failure. It's conditioning. Advertising, social media, workplace culture, and even financial institutions reinforce the idea that a good life is one that's visible now. Wealth, on the other hand, is invisible and slow. It doesn't signal status in the short term. In fact, many wealth-building behaviors look like underperformance compared to peers. Driving an older car, living below your means, saying no to things that everyone else can afford. These choices don't feel neutral. They feel like quiet social losses, and most people avoid them not because they don't understand the math, but because they understand the psychology too well. If this pattern continues unchecked, the long-term impact isn't dramatic collapse, it's dependence. Dependence on steady income, dependence on economic stability, dependence on health, employment, and external systems behaving perfectly for decades. The margin for error shrinks. A job loss becomes a crisis instead of an inconvenience. A medical expense becomes debt instead of a setback. Retirement becomes a calculation filled with anxiety rather than confidence. And this is where the real cost of being average shows itself. Not as poverty, but as fragility. You can't stop working easily. You can't take meaningful risks. You can't buy time. Your money supports your lifestyle, but it doesn't support your freedom. And because everything looks fine on the surface, this fragility often goes unexamined until later in life, when changing direction becomes harder, slower, and more emotionally loaded. The uncomfortable truth is that the system doesn't need people to fail. It just needs them to stay engaged. As long as you earn, spend, borrow, and repeat, the machine runs smoothly. Being average is not punished, it's optimized for, an understanding that doesn't require anger or rebellion. It requires clarity. Once you see that the default path is expensive not because of extravagance but because of structure, the conversation shifts. The question stops being, how do I earn more? And becomes, what is my money actually buying me over time? Not status, not comfort, but control, or the lack of it. Over time, the most damaging part of this pattern isn't the money itself. It's how it shapes expectations about the future. When your entire financial life is built around maintaining an average standard, the future becomes something you finance rather than something you prepare for. Retirement, for example, turns into a distant abstraction. It's discussed in terms of accounts, percentages, and employer matches, but emotionally it feels unreal. There's always an assumption that future income will solve future problems. That assumption works until it doesn't. And the reason it's so common is because average living conditions train people to think in short cycles. Monthly bills, annual raises, 2-week vacations. The time horizon shrinks. Long-term thinking feels optional rather than essential. When money only ever feels just enough, it's difficult to imagine abundance in any meaningful sense. Not luxury, but security. Not more things, but more time. Let's extend the math forward calmly and without drama. Suppose our average earner manages to save and invest $300 a month consistently. That's already more disciplined than most. Over a year, that's $3,600. Over 10 years, $36,000 in contributions. With reasonable market returns, maybe that grows to $50,000 or $60,000. That sounds like progress, and it is, but now place it in context. After 10 years of work, education, stress, and responsibility, $60,000 doesn't buy independence. It doesn't replace income. It doesn't change how you live day to day. It sits quietly in the background, reassuring but not transformative. Meanwhile, the obligations remain. Mortgage balances decline slowly. Car loans reset every few years. Living costs rise. Healthcare becomes more expensive. The savings exist, but they don't change behavior. And that's the key difference between savings and wealth. Savings are defensive, wealth is strategic. One protects you from small shocks, the other changes the rules of the game. The psychological reason most people accept this outcome is subtle but powerful. Humans are loss-averse. We feel losses more intensely than gains. Choosing a financially conservative path that looks average feels safe because it avoids visible loss. You're not missing payments, you're not falling behind peers, you're not explaining uncomfortable choices to friends or family. The cost, however, is invisible. It's the wealth you didn't build, the options you didn't create, the years you didn't buy back. Because there's no clear moment where you feel that loss, it doesn't trigger urgency. Instead, it shows up as a low-level tension that becomes normal over time. People adapt to it. They build identities around being responsible and realistic. Those words sound positive, but they can also become limits. They quietly cap ambition not in income but in freedom. What financially intelligent people tend to do differently is not dramatic or extreme. They don't necessarily earn more, work harder, or take reckless risks. What they do is shift the frame. Instead of asking, "Can I afford this?" they ask, "What does this cost me over time?" That question changes everything. A car isn't just a payment, it's lost investment capital. A bigger apartment isn't just comfort, it's reduced optionality. Financially intelligent behavior often looks boring because it prioritizes asymmetry. Small sacrifices now in exchange for disproportionate control later. This isn't about deprivation, it's about sequencing. Average financial behavior prioritizes comfort early and security late. Intelligent financial behavior reverses that order. It builds resilience first, then expands lifestyle gradually, intentionally, and without dependence on constant income growth. The long-term impact of ignoring this shift isn't failure, it's delayed adulthood in a financial sense. People reach their 40s and 50s still dependent on paychecks, still exposed to economic cycles, still negotiating with money instead of directing it. At that point, change feels heavier, not impossible but emotionally complex. Responsibilities are larger, time feels scarcer, the stakes feel higher. This is why the cost of being average is best understood early, not because it demands immediate action but because it reframes what doing well actually means. Doing well isn't matching the lifestyle of your peers. It's reducing the number of things that can force your hand later, and that understanding doesn't make you anxious or guilty. If anything, it creates calm, because once you see the system clearly, you stop blaming yourself, and you start choosing more deliberately. Once that perspective shifts, the entire idea of progress starts to look different. Progress stops being about visible upgrades and starts being about invisible leverage. This is where many people get confused because invisible progress doesn't feel like progress at all. There's no social reinforcement for it. Nobody compliments you on a lower fixed-cost lifestyle. No one notices that your investment contributions quietly increased while your expenses stayed flat. And yet, this is where the real divergence happens over time. Two people can earn similar incomes, live in similar cities, and appear equally successful on the surface, while their financial trajectories move in completely different directions. The difference isn't discipline or intelligence, it's structure. One life is built around commitments, the other is built around options. Consider how fixed costs behave over time. Every long-term commitment you take on assumes that your future income will reliably support it. That assumption often holds until it doesn't. Economic downturns, industry shifts, health issues, family responsibilities. These aren't rare events, they're normal life events. Financially average living assumes stability as a baseline rather than a variable. Financially intelligent living treats stability as temporary and plans accordingly. This doesn't mean expecting disaster. It means acknowledging uncertainty without fear. When your fixed costs are low relative to income, uncertainty becomes manageable. When they're high, uncertainty becomes existential. That's not a mindset problem, that's math. What's interesting is how rarely this is framed honestly. Most financial conversations focus on optimization, better returns, smarter budgets, higher income. But optimization only matters after structure is sound. If your financial life is rigid, no amount of optimization will create freedom. It might improve efficiency, but efficiency in a constrained system still leaves you constrained. This is why so many financially responsible people feel trapped despite doing everything right. They optimized within a framework that was never designed for flexibility. Average living prioritizes predictability, wealth building prioritizes resilience. One feels comfortable in the short term, the other feels calm in the long term. There's also a social element that's rarely acknowledged. In both the US and Europe, middle-class identity is tightly linked to consumption patterns. The car you drive, the neighborhood you live in, the experiences you participate in, they all signal belonging. Choosing differently can feel like opting out even temporarily, and humans are deeply uncomfortable with that. We are wired to avoid social friction. This is why many people continue along the average path even after intellectually understanding the cost. It's not ignorance, it's emotional economics. The fear isn't being poor, it's being perceived as falling behind. Financial intelligence often requires tolerating a period of quiet misalignment with your peer group. That period feels awkward, but it's also where independence is built. Over decades, this divergence compounds. The person who prioritized optionality early finds that their money starts doing more of the work, not because they chased high returns but because they gave compounding time and space to operate. Their expenses grew slower than their income. Their commitments remained intentional. When opportunities appeared, career changes, relocations, investments, they could say yes without panic. The average path, by contrast, produces a life that must be continuously funded. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it leaves little room for agency. You don't choose freely. You negotiate constantly with your employer, with your bank, with your future self. The cost of being average, then, isn't that you'll struggle forever. It's that you'll remain dependent longer than you realize. And dependency isn't always obvious. It can wear the clothes of comfort and stability. It can look like success, but it limits your ability to shape your life intentionally. Recognizing this doesn't require radical change. It requires honesty. An honest look at what your money is actually securing for you. Not today, but 10 or 20 years from now. When you ask that question calmly, without judgment, the answers tend to be clearer than expected. At this point, the conversation naturally settles into something quieter, more reflective. Not a call to action, not a list of changes, but a recalibration of what average really means. Being average isn't a personal failing. It's the statistical center of a system that's become increasingly expensive to exist within. The real issue is that people aim too low. It's that they aim at the wrong target. Comfort, status, and short-term stability are understandable goals, but they're often mistaken for progress. Over time, they can become substitutes for something more valuable: control over how your time and energy are spent. When you view money through that lens, the conversation changes. It stops being about accumulation and starts being about alignment. Financially intelligent people aren't immune to pressure, temptation, or uncertainty. They feel the same pull toward convenience and consumption. The difference is that they interpret those impulses differently. Instead of asking what something adds to their life today, they ask what it demands from their future. That question isn't asked with anxiety or rigidity, it's asked with patience. And patience is the one ingredient the average path quietly erodes. When every decision is optimized for immediate normalcy, patience feels impractical. When decisions are optimized for long-term agency, patience becomes natural. You don't need dramatic sacrifices, you just need fewer irreversible ones. The most understated advantage of stepping off the average path isn't higher net worth, it's psychological relief. When your life isn't tightly bound to your income, stress behaves differently. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes more proportional. Problems feel solvable rather than threatening. Choices feel open rather than forced. This shift often happens gradually, almost unnoticed, until one day you realize that money no longer dictates every decision. That realization doesn't come from earning more, it comes from needing less and planning earlier. Not because you were afraid, but because you were honest about trade-offs. None of this requires rejecting modern life or living dramatically below your means. It requires clarity about what you're buying when you say yes to the default. Average living buys acceptance, predictability, and comfort today. It also quietly sells off flexibility tomorrow. Whether that trade is worth it isn't a moral question. It's a personal one, but it's a question worth asking consciously rather than inheriting unconsciously. The cost of being average isn't measured in dollars alone. It's measured in how many choices remain open later in life. If there's one takeaway from this entire discussion, it's not that you need to change everything. It's that awareness itself has value. Once you see the structure, you can decide how much of it you want to participate in. You can keep what genuinely improves your life and question what simply maintains appearances. That's not rebellion, it's discernment, and discernment tends to age well. If this way of thinking resonates, calm, realistic, and grounded, consider subscribing or liking the video, not for motivation but for clarity.